Welcome to a new series of conversations with experts in various fields that are important to architects. My name is Marcus Marino, and this is the American Institute of Architects of New York State Conversations on Topics. There'll be a series of these throughout the year, and we hope is a program which we will continue going forward, helping educate legislators, fellow architects, and all citizens as to the importance of design within our built environment, which architects are most suited to help out in. Thank you, and then please enjoy them.
Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome you here today on behalf of the American Institute of Architects, New York State. We're sponsoring a wonderful talk today about resilience. And to define resilience, resilience is being able to bounce back after an event or a disaster, and to be able to bounce forward perhaps. And with that, I'd like to welcome our colleagues here to provide some of the aspects of solutions that architects are working on. And to my left, we have Nicholas Rakovich. He is a PhD and AIA member and assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you.
Next, we have Claire Weiss, FAIA. She's the principal of WXY Architecture and Urban Design. Claire is an architect and urbanist, founding principal of her firm, and she just received the AIA New York State Firm Award for 2016. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And followed by Don Watson. Don Watson is also a fellow of the AIA. He's an architect and author of professional reference books, most recently Design for Flooding, Resilience, and Climate Change. Welcome, Don. And last but not least, a good friend, Dean Evans, also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He runs the Center for Resilient Design at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Welcome, all of you.
Thanks.
And to get us rolling today, even though I gave a brief definition of, a reductive definition of resilience, we do want to go on into sort of how do we really look at resilience in the long term. And Nick, I know you're doing a lot of work. How far do we need to forecast if we're going to tackle resilience as community building, as architects?
Thanks. I think that's a really great question. It really depends. The short answer is how long we want our buildings to last. So if we think about temporary buildings, it may not be as much of a concern because we're dealing with more immediate threats. But most of the buildings we're trying to build, especially our civic structures, we really want those to last well into the future. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that every part of the building needs to come up to begin to address things like climate change right now, because that is kind of a gradual process. But the things that are the most important and are going to last with buildings, like the structure of the building or the foundations and things like that, that's something we really want to prepare for the absolute long term. Whereas some of the things that are maybe more short-term systems, things like the roofing or other things, we may go through several cycles of replacing those things over time. So,
has this been a change in the way we practice?
I think it's starting to be a change in the way that we practice. I think the great thing from a design perspective is that it actually means we put money, we put the investment into things that are going to last the longest. So it changes some of the ways that we think about that calculation. But I think architects have always been concerned, though, about having the best building possible. And so this, in many ways, really puts us forefront in that issue.
Any responses to that or additions? I know we used to look at a life cycle of a building in a certain way. Has that changed substantially in regards to resilience, as Nick is putting forward?
I think some of the changes may come in terms of how we define the parameters for a life cycle analysis. I think the time frame may get longer, and the concept that is prevalent in sustainability around life cycle benefits, cost benefit, and payback, I think the definitions of how those are calculated are going to change, because there may be some inconsistencies between designing for optimal efficiencies and designing for long-term longevity and durability. And so the cost benefit function there may change a little bit, I think, as we move forward. It's still in early days, but I think that may start to happen.
Before we move into the nitty-gritty of those elements, it might be interesting. I know, Don, you're working with this idea of this long-term design challenge. I know you work with Rebuild by Design, especially in Connecticut. Can you give us an idea of what some of the solution-based, or how do we approach this type of design paradigm, given your experience?
Sure, and the question of investment in a building and life cycle cost with increased natural disasters, business or operational interruptibility is foremost. And in the case of some businesses, after events such as Hurricane Sandy, some 40% have been unable to return to business. So the interesting question is, not only is what is the value of my building, but what is the value of my community? How safe, how accessible is my community? The HUD-sponsored Rebuild by Design is post-Sandy, after Sandy recovery. It had initially a $1 billion budget. It had a competition, 270 submissions, of which 7 were selected. One is in Bridgeport. I'm very much connected with it. And it was selected in an interesting case because it, in a sense, represents the worst case. If you were to say what community is most at risk, this is an example where approximately 3,000 houses were somehow touched by water, and they're historically important. Both business and industry is at risk. So one of the things we've learned, and all this is positive, what have we learned? We're now in year 2 of what will be a longer term project. And changing the roads or the location of the railroad, which actually is very expensive, if at all possible, to lift, but it creates blockages where there's flood blockages because of low bridges, etc. So those infrastructure questions, to answer your question, are probably the 100-year plus, because where we put a road, where we put a bridge, with some flexibility about building. One of the sort of the wins, the positive thing is in our discussions, no person is left out of discussion. The whole community is engaged. And we've had community meetings where folks who you wouldn't think would get involved are asking very specific questions. And the best idea comes from the least expected neighborhood source. So that's very important as part of the face of resilience. Another rule that we've learned is tell the truth as best you can. And when you don't know the answer, say, we don't know the answer. If your family is affected by some health, there's someone who has a disease, your whole family learns about that in great detail very quickly. And what we found is the community has learned that and essentially established a dialogue based on truth. Another win is that it's forced us to look at the economic benefits and well-being of the entire community. And sometimes
would you say that's the value that that as an architect-led team that's going to bring to this rebuild by design, that we've had a long history of SDATs and RUDATs, which are the whole community design effort. Are you discovering that is a huge benefit, this community engagement?
Yes, and to use the medical metaphor a bit more, if I go to the doctor and complain about my elbow, he says it's actually diet, posture, a health problem. Let's look at the positive and do a whole health diagnosis. We are doing that with the communities at risk and actually getting to the positive vision of how we want to live and where we want to live. What the designers and architects bring to that is incredible, invaluable ability to visualize, to show you options. So we've been at community meetings where folks don't understand the technical language, but show them a model, they can engage with it. So those are 4 points. In the end, regardless of where you are living, we're looking at the whole water system of our region and asking people to think like a watershed. And if you're designing a building, to see that building as part of that water, whether it's arid, dry, or flood rich. Water is essential.
And in response to what Nick had brought forward about the sort of long-term design challenge in some of the systems, that's part of the equation. Claire, you're running an amazing design practice that really engages the implementation of resilient design projects. What can you tell us about maybe an example of a project that is underway in implementation? Because we have to build these things. As far as rebuild by design, these enormous projects, what is the end game, and how do we get there? Can you give us an example?
So I want to really build on what
Please.
Don was talking about in terms of architecture and design is actually faced with real problems that even and with in a way we get to learn from those problems. We're a discipline that gets to look at an event like Sandy and see what comes out of it, work with it, and then understand that we have to design and prepare for the next time, not knowing at all because what the next risk is. It will look nothing like the risk we had. There will never be exactly that risk. So to speak to that, the Rockaways is such a great example because the entire Rockaway community was affected by this disaster. The boardwalk was thrown into people's homes. Most people had to rebuild their homes, so there was design problems that needed architects and engineers from everyone's house to their big space. But what we learned from going out there, from working with the community, from having that opportunity to rebuild, is that rebuild is difficult because change is difficult.
Right.
And when you tell someone that their boardwalk is not going to be made out of wood anymore and is going to be 6 feet in front of their windows of their house when they used to walk right on it, that's a change that's hard to accept. So instead of...
And a design challenge.
It's a design challenge.
Yeah.
So, but architects really are at the bleeding edge of understanding how to describe change, but how to see it positively. And when you look at this example of now the Rockaway Boardwalk is a safe harbor, and people understood they had nowhere safe to go.
Right.
Well, when something is resilient, it is also at a much safer level and it's new. That means if there's a certain disaster, you have to go, there's now going to be safe power, it's higher, and it's a place that people share and enjoy and can talk to each other and build up their communities again. They can find out whose house isn't rebuilt. They can work towards a new art gallery. They can do so the civic commons is really one of the most, and whether that's libraries, transit centers, churches, community centers, ultimately I think is really some of the most important small examples of how to build back communities.
That's fantastic. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but clearly architects have the solution.
Right.
Dean, I know you're working at a regional level at the multiple scales, and the work you're doing with the NRI. Could you tell us a little bit about that to segue into the work that you're doing on maybe
happy
that
to.
scale?
So the NRI, the National Resilience Initiative, is a consortium, I guess you'd call it, or a network, of 6 architectural school programs around the country that are focused on the issue of resilience and adaptation. And it was spearheaded by the AIA and the AIA Foundation National. They galvanized the whole process of pulling these groups together. My center is one of them. There's one in Hampton, Virginia, one in Arkansas, one at University of Mississippi, one in California, and one in Minnesota. And the idea is that the network could grow over time. That's sort of the initial group. But the goal is to engage in resilient exploration, resilience and adaptation explorations at the university level within the architectural programs, but to also engage with the local and regional communities around the schools. So I'm in New Jersey. We're sort of the New York metro region, a bit of the Northeast, bit of the Mid-Atlantic, and then on down to the Gulf Coast and the lower Atlantic states. But the idea is to try and come up with regionally utilizable solutions to the whole resilience and adaptation initiative and bring the university and the academia world more engaged with the community around these critical issues.
That's fantastic. You're working at a couple of scales as you're illuminating universities as a resource where I can go, whether I'm a homeowner or an architect, and then everyone is engaged seemingly on this panel in how to solve these problems. So architects are part of the solution. Can you briefly describe the smallest scale you've been working at?
Right. So this goes to what Claire and Don were talking about as well. We're working right now, oddly enough, with Ilya on a project in Breezy Point in New York, and that's a rebuild of a house that was damaged by Sandy, and it's innovative. It's a sustainable, resilient rebuild of a home, but we're engaging university students to actually document that project from a very detailed perspective, looking at all the different systems that are going into it, how they're being connected, how they're working, both as a tool for other professionals around our region and around the country, but also as a teaching tool within the schools themselves. So it's a double benefit. But one of the things, further what Don and Claire were talking about, what the students can do whether they understand exactly how these buildings are being built, and I think all of us know, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they can visualize, and that's an incredible, they can do a lot with visualization tools that help the community and also help in education. So that's a very small scale nitty gritty. We're also working at larger scales where we worked with a major transit stop in New Jersey to really document that and determine how it could be made more resilient. And New Jersey Transit was involved with that, and they recognized, like a lot of clients do when you're engaged with the University School of Architecture, it's probably not really going to work in the real world, but it's going to allow us as the transit group to think outside the box. And students will come up with ideas that may not be implementable in exactly the form they've done them, but are sort of, well, wait a second, we've never thought of this that way before. And it's an incredibly valuable capacity to have, and the university has it built in. Students love to do it, and they're good at it. And transit loves some of the things that came out of it,
That's
even
really
not
amazing.
the specifics. Yeah,
That's amazing. The visualization. Don, you had mentioned something briefly about the most important thing for the community are these models. Is this a visualization that
no
really
matter
is important?
what culture or country or education group, a physical model, and it doesn't have to be expensive. It could be made of sand and sticks. You know, one of the challenges is not to build back, but to build back not only better, but smarter. And just realize that if the climate issue is driven by fossil fuel, to now design your buildings to be off of fossil and onto renewables. And that integration of what we call the green or the sustainable design with resilience, it's an extraordinary design assignment, okay?
Right.
And you'll actually come up with solutions to one that you hadn't thought about just because you have that richness of, and always when we have that 1 minute elevator exposure to the legislature or to the mayor, and they said, just don't add another problem to my, and the point to be made is by adding the problems, you actually increase the solution set.
Right.
So often we find that if we follow the waste nutrient stream in a neighborhood, there's actually a money stream that reduces the pollution, et cetera. So let us make the problem complex without making it complicated.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
And the ability of a design team to work as an integrated set with new disciplines at the table is what we can bring to every community we're working.
Collaboration. Claire, you mentioned collaboration before we started this panel. Does that play into some of the things that you've experienced in practice?
Yeah, I think it's really critical, and just to, as everyone's reflected, that for the first time, I think scientists are really engaged directly, and as well as people in various disciplines, including various forms of environmental psychology, in directly with designers in understanding that the true complexities of a problem are where design processes are at its best, and that's where solutions that are higher value come out of it. I think that when everyone recognized that many low-cost solutions and low-cost buildings, or just straight, solve one single problem, actually become bigger problems with greater climate risk. So pretty soon you're dealing with projects that were just a highway, just a sidewalk, but not actually something integrated that including biking, walking, cars, and buildings the same way.
The entire ecosystem.
Right, the entire ecosystem. And they're actually not performing. They're the things that fail. So in order to create something that not only doesn't fail, but is something that people want to make sure doesn't get rebuilt and that are going to value, you need these more complex factors. That requires science.
Nick, you're working on this, exactly what Claire just said. My understanding is that's the core of your work. Can you give us an example of maybe in Buffalo or how ecosystems and resilience are tied together?
Sure. So, if you look at the whole ecology, the whole building ecology, and try to understand some of the different professions that come together, we all have different ways of working and thinking about these problems. And rather than seeing that interdisciplinarity as being a liability, it actually helps us to check each other's work and to come up with new ways to actually address these problems. And the challenge is to get everybody talking together and starting to use some of the same language. And I think students are really great at doing that. They have absolutely no fear in these situations, and they don't know that they shouldn't be digging into something. And And that enthusiasm, I think, bodes well for our future. It's really a positive thing because, I hope someday if I get, if I retire, that my students are designing these things and carrying on some of these issues, because the buildings I'm going to live in, 35 years from now are something that these kids are, in school right now are going to design. So, I think it's a very positive thing, and bringing them to the table really makes me excited for the future.
Whatever we can do to engage, and there's a lot we can do to create hopeful community dialogue about a positive vision for our future. And all that the AIA has done with, actually some from the 1960s, in engaging communities with participatory design is in our favor.
I think that's brilliant, and we're going to have to leave it there. This conversation is going to keep going, because resilience, even though it has only become forefront of the American consciousness, it's something that you all know has been at the forefront of design for decades. As we've seen changes, architects have come forward with amazing solutions. And I'm very encouraged that my colleagues and myself and a lot of us practicing in the state of New York and throughout the nation are really working on these challenges. And so thank you again for joining me today and joining the AI New York State. And thank you, AI New York State, for having us.